Welcome to New Unrealist. U.S. President Donald Trump was in Brussels today attending the NATO summit. And the media build-up to this summit was amazing to me as they focus on the soap opera of, Donald Trump and Angela Merkel confront each other over Germany's NATO commitments. And basically, the Trump alienates our European allies narrative. Now look, I realize how the news business works these days, and yeah, they've got to drive eyeballs and clicks, so they need to punch up the personal conflict narratives. Fine, I accept that. But what I find alarming is how there seems to be no mention of the substance of what President Trump is saying. I mean, just because he's Trump, I guess, but because the situation is not something he's making up. Germany's military isn't just, a little underfunded or small. It's a fiction. In some areas of their military, it exists only on paper. I skimmed headlines for just the last 6 months alone, and it's alarming. In a report in The Local, a German publication from February of 2015, this was the state of the German Bundeswehr. They showed up to NATO maneuvers in Norway, maneuvers intended to train for and deter Russian aggression against Ukraine and the Baltic states. They showed up without enough machine guns to mount on their armored vehicles for the commander to use. I mean, the exercise was NATO's so-called Rapid Response Force, supposedly a high-readiness multinational force supposed to be able to deploy on short notice. Short notice, eh? Despite this being a scheduled maneuver, likely with months, if not a year or more to prepare, an inspector from the German army was told by a soldier that the Boxer mobile headquarters vehicle had a broomstick painted black mounted where the commander's machine gun was supposed to be mounted. So the commander of the German Bundeswehr's Panzergrenadier Battalion 371, in the event of action against the Russians, would have gone into battle with a broomstick in his gun turret. Why? Because 31% of the MG3 general-purpose machine guns required to equip it were absent. 41% of the soldiers lacked even a basic sidearm. I mean, what does the German Bundeswehr use? The P8, right? So imagine that. Nearly half the soldiers in the Rapid Reaction Force, the tip of the spear, didn't even have a pistol. They lacked night vision equipment. 3/4 of the Lucy night vision devices weren't available. Grenade launchers. Germany's in the G6, one of the world's top 6 economies. They have some of the best gun manufacturers in the world, like Heckler & Koch at a 6 Hour, yet they couldn't even field a rapid reaction battalion with enough guns. Now, okay, maybe that exercise from 4 years ago was just some kind of logistics snafu. Surely, the Germans, who are infamous for their logistics and administrative acumen, do not have chronic shortages of basic military equipment for their full-time armed forces. You'd be wrong. In 2019, Germany is scheduled to take command of NATO's Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, the VJTF, a 5,000-man force created to defend the Baltic countries from Russian attack after Russia annexed Crimea. The German army, assigned to this Very High Readiness unit, mind you, according to the German newspaper Rheinische Post, citing a paper presented to the German Defense Ministry, the Bundeswehr lacks basic equipment for the NATO mission. I don't know if any of you have ever been to places like Lithuania, Estonia, hell, Russia for that matter, in the winter. It gets very cold. The paper by Germany's Army Command says that the army would lack sufficient tents until at least the year 2021. Germany takes command of the force in 2019, just 6 months from now. Of the 10,282 mobile accommodation units, otherwise known as tents in plain English, unless I'm misreading this, the German Bundeswehr can only muster 2,500 units for the period 2018 to 2020, and that even those 2,500 are not fit for the purpose. In other words, they're shitty tents not intended for the frozen winters in those far north Baltic climates. I mean, between Napoleon's invasion of Russia and Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, unless I'm remembering incorrectly, more soldiers died in Russia from the freezing winter than were lost in actual combat. The report also says that protective vests and winter clothing were also in short supply, that it would be impossible to ensure that the demand could be met. So these soldiers, this rapid reaction force, would go into battle in modern warfare without ballistic protection and clothes for the cold winter in Russia. Oh, it gets better. Other reports show that Germany has, I'm not making this up, they've been using Mercedes vans. You heard that right. Civilian minivans as stand-ins for armored personnel carriers, on training exercises. They've been using Nissan Pathfinder 4x4s in place of Eagle 4 armored ambulances, and civilian off-roaders in place of Dingo armored vehicles. A unit of Germany's KSK Special Forces had to pull out of a joint exercise with NATO because they didn't even have one operational helicopter available. On paper, this elite Special Forces unit had 9 helicopters assigned. In reality, 8 were out of service, and the 9th only had 3 hours of flying time left before a mandatory inspection, and therefore not enough time to participate in the exercise. They were embarrassed. The Luftwaffe delivered, that's the German Air Force, for those of you who don't know, they delivered a report in 2015 that said it had a squadron that was able to complete less than 2/3 of its scheduled training flight hours, barely sufficient to train air crews to a NATO standard. The report also said Army barracks were in disastrous shape, 38% having, quote, serious deficiencies. 269 of the buildings were uninhabitable due to mold. That same year, they reported only 42 out of Germany's 109 Typhoon fighters were available for use due to maintenance issues, and only 38 out of 89 Tornado bombers. Now let's think about that. In the event of war with Russia, Germany's Air Force would only have been able to respond with 42 Typhoon fighters and 38 Tornado bombers. In tanks, that 2015 report said only 280 of the Army's 406 Martin tanks were even operational. Okay, Neo, okay, you might be saying the German military was in really bad shape back in 2014 and 2015. Surely, things have gotten better. Well, February 2018, the German Bundeswehr lacks tanks to fulfill its obligations to NATO as the 9th Tank Brigade stationed in Munster, which according to the Army's plan should be engaged in NATO's new force. It has only 9, I repeat, 9 of the required 44 Leopard 2 tanks and 3 of the 14 Marder infantry fighting vehicles, according to Der Welt newspaper, citing a secret document in Germany's defense ministry. The reason why Germany can only spare 9 tanks and 3 IFVs for that force? The lack of spare parts and the high maintenance costs. It sounds to me like the German military could use more money. Just an idea. I mean, money buys spare parts and pays for maintenance. I'm guessing that 9 tanks isn't going to deter Vladimir Putin in the event of hostilities with NATO. This is a chronic problem for the German military in that on paper, they have their main battle tank, 244 Leopard 2 tanks. That's their version of our the way we use our M1 Abrams tanks, that's the Germans used the Leopard 2. That's their main battle tank. In the real world, they only have 95 of them at anywhere near combat readiness. 53 are being upgraded, 7 are at test sites, the rest are simply out of service because they can't be repaired without spare parts. 95 tanks operational for the entire German military. The German Defense Ministry, they even suspended the purchase of new Leopard 2 tanks due to the fact they can't even afford to keep the ones they already have operational due to a lack of funds. This is not just a story of old vehicles breaking down and being out of repair. Even the newer vehicles seem to have a problem. The Puma, an infantry fighting vehicle that's supposed to replace the very aged Marder infantry fighting vehicles, they're defective. They can't even keep the rain out. I'm not kidding. This thing was issued with a top hatch in the rear troop compartment that couldn't be hermetically sealed. Heavy rainfall could literally reach the men inside. Rainfall. I mean, what could be so bad about that, you might ask? Well, if rainwater can get inside, then so could things like smoke, burning napalm, nerve gas. Starting to get the picture? They had to develop a new insulation device that will be installed on the defective Pumas to get them up to snuff. How about that German Navy? 6 submarines ready to go, Herr Kapellein. Well, on paper anyway, since 6 out of the 6 subs weren't operational as of February. As far as I know, they still aren't. Just like Germany's air transport fleet of 15 Airbus A400Ms. On paper, 14 transports. In reality, not a single plane can fly. All of the vehicles are out of order and need maintenance. The BBC reported in February that thousands, I repeat, thousands of officer positions are vacant. There's not enough German officers. How do you run a modern military force without adequate leadership? So let's circle back to the spat between President Trump, Chancellor Merkel, and the EU. When the EU president this week chided Trump to be more appreciative of his allies because he didn't have so many, I wondered to myself what it was Trump was supposed to appreciate. You have Germany's participation in the fight against ISIS. It certainly isn't a ground commitment. Okay, there are no German ground forces that were in Syria or Iraq. The only participation that they did in operations against ISIS was in the air. Well, alleged participation because all they did were recon flights, and even that was limited. Why? Because the German reconnaissance aircraft's cockpit lighting was too bright for pilots to fly at night. What is it exactly that Germany, the single largest economy and country in Europe, what is it that they contribute as a military ally? An entire submarine force that's in dry dock without a single operational submarine, an air force that can't even muster 100 frontline operational combat jets, and can't or won't drop a bomb on ISIS when you need them to, an armor contingent that can't even field 100 operational units of its main battle tank, an air transport arm without any operational transport, so they can't even lift humanitarian supplies to, say, an earthquake, let alone military supplies or transport combat troops for themselves in the event of hostilities with Russia. Not enough operational helicopters to even train their own helicopter pilots. They had to outsource that function to an outside civilian company, let alone field combat-ready helicopters. Units of what are supposed to be crack soldiers attached to critical rapid reaction forces who don't have enough guns, protective vests, clothes, tents, to operate in subarctic conditions that you'd find in the Baltic countries and in Eastern Europe. Night vision equipment. Germany couldn't defend itself from an incursion by some of the larger Chicago street gangs, from the look of it, let alone be a useful military ally against, Russia. So over the next few days, when you hear the media back and forth about Trump criticizing EU countries, Germany specifically, because I think Trump's ire is really mostly about Germany, because they have no excuse. Germany is one of the world's very top economies. It's the world's 3rd largest exporter of arms and military equipment, so this is inconceivable. There's no excuse for fielding a Potemkin village of a military for what should be one of the world's leading military powers. That's all for this New Unrealist. Like the video, comment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. Make sure to set the option to always, because remember, the default is sometimes. So if you actually do want to get notifications, set it to always. Thanks for watching.